Perhaps when you've been talking in your special education circle, you've heard the discussion of the educational model versus the medical model. And quite frankly, it can get a little confusing.
Right.
Hopefully we're going to bring some clarity to you regarding eligibility versus diagnosis.
Yeah.
Jen, let's talk about it.
Okay, and this is one of those really good examples where parents and school districts sometimes just speak a different language. And one of the biggest contributors, in my experience, to disputes is that the parents are not understanding the terminology that the school district is using, and the school district isn't doing much to make the parents understand their terminology or their rights for that matter. And so often I get involved and I say, I see what the problem here is, and it's really not a problem, it just needs to be explained to you. So this is a great example of when this happens. Diagnosis is what you get from a doctor, a psychologist, some outside, often medical professional, it doesn't have to be medical professional, but someone who has the authority to issue a diagnosis, such as autism, such as any number of disabilities. And you get a diagnosis from an outside person, and sometimes you can even get a diagnosis from someone that the school district pays to evaluate the child, okay? That is different from whether or not a child is eligible for special education and related services under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the special ed laws. Just because you have a particular diagnosed disability doesn't mean you're eligible for services.
And if I could just clarify, it's a diagnosis of a disability.
Correct.
We're talking about a diagnosis under the education umbrella here.
Right.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
So just because you have a diagnosis from somebody that there is a particular disability doesn't mean you are eligible for services. And the IDEA has a number of eligibility categories that certainly do not cover every single diagnosis that a person could have. And so parents will sometimes get very frustrated because they have a particular diagnosis that isn't an eligibility category, and they're in a fight with their school district because they don't believe the child's individualized education program properly reflects the child's disability. And all it would have taken is for some person from the school to say, I realize that your child's diagnosis is Tourette syndrome is not an eligibility category under the IDEA, but certainly many kids who have Tourette syndrome receive specialized instruction, receive special services. They may fall under a different eligibility category, such as other health impaired or some other area that covers it. Parents will say, but my child has Tourette syndrome. It doesn't say that on the first page of the document. You didn't reflect it properly. When in fact, it's not reflecting the diagnosis, it's reflecting the eligibility category. And there's a big difference. So parents have to get used to the difference between the educational model and the medical model.
The other thing that I could add to that is just because your child has a diagnosis, which is a disability, a federally recognized disability, doesn't make them eligible necessarily for special education services.
Right.
So you can have a diagnosis and still not be eligible. Perhaps you can be, but you need to know just because there is a diagnosis isn't a ticket to special education.
So an example being a child has bipolar disorder. That's their diagnosis. A psychiatrist has issued that diagnosis. They present that diagnosis to the school district. The school district has to make a determination about whether that child's particular constellation of issues are such that it adversely impacts their education. And if they make that determination that that child requires specialized instruction because of that, then they would usually say this child is eligible as having an emotional disturbance. That's the eligibility category.
The category.
Bipolar disorder is not an eligibility category, it's a diagnosis.
Right.
And so many disputes erupt because nobody sits down to explain the difference in those different systems.
Right.